Noswaith pawb, good evening everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us this evening, and for those of you that have already sent some questions in ahead of this Facebook Live session, but please do feel free to continue to submit your questions. Before we get started, I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody here in Wales that has sacrificed so much that has allowed us the headroom to see our youngest pupils return to school this week. So a massive, massive thank you for everything that that you've done to follow the guidance and to create that headroom. I'm really, really grateful, and a massive thank you, of course, to our educators and our parents and carers that have done so much to support children over the last few weeks and months now, since we haven't had to be able to have all our children for face-to-face learning in our schools. So, to the questions, and first of all we're going to go to Jade, and Jade asks, how do you plan on improving well-being in schools following this? Personally, I think the first few weeks back should be well-being weeks, positivity groups, building friendships and working on how this has affected them and their mental health. Well, Jade, I couldn't agree with you more. What we know, unless we address children's well-being, then we cannot get learning to stick. And that's why we've given some freedom to our head teachers and lessened some of the bureaucratic restrictions that they're usually under, to allow them the freedom to do just these kind of activities that you're talking about. And I was lucky enough to visit a primary school this morning to talk to the head teacher about how they are absolutely focusing on reintroducing the children to each other, making sure that children are aware of some of the procedures, you know, around the washing of hands and doing all the right things in school, and then beginning to, you know, focus in again on learning. So you're absolutely right. And what's really important is that this has been recognised by our Chief Inspector of Schools. Miley Rowlands, who is the head of Estin, our school inspectorate, did a review into how schools have been supporting children during this time, and he was full of compliments of how schools have really, really focused in on children's well-being, and that being a prerequisite then to ensure that their time at school is productive and happy. We'll now go to Sean, who asks, are you willing to look at revising your plans for older children to return to school, given the fall in numbers of infections continuing, the hospital admissions falling, and peers in England returning to school many weeks before Welsh students, along with plans to open up tourism weeks before planning on sending some age groups back to school? Well, Sian, I'm delighted that we've been able to get some of our children back into school ahead of our neighbours across the border in England. And I am constantly looking at the latest scientific evidence, because like you, I want children back to face-to-face teaching as quickly as we are able to do that safely and in line with the advice and guidance that is coming from scientists. And I would say, you know, please have a look for yourself. All the science that guides my decision is published on the Welsh Government website, and you can have a look as to the advice that I'm receiving and how that advice then translates into how we are opening up education again. And the UK-wide advice and the Welsh advice is that any return to school has to be done carefully and cautiously, and we have to return some schools, wait to ensure that there are no adverse incidents as a result of that, that we don't see a spike in infections, that we don't jeopardise the hard-won gains that we've been able to make against coronavirus. And they would like that to happen in spaces of 3 weeks. And that's why we have foundation phase back this week for 3 weeks to monitor that situation. And then, with all the caveats and very much the factors that you've talked about here, we can get all primary school back beginning on the 15th, as well as introducing years 11 and 13, and where schools are able to accommodate years 10 and 12 back into school. Unfortunately, we then run up against the buffer of the Easter holidays, which I'm afraid I can't do anything about, and that doesn't, and it's particularly early this year, which is frustrating. That doesn't give us then the 3 weeks to monitor the impact of having that cohort of children back before we can get the next cohort of children. But I'm looking all the time at how other countries have approached a return to school, looking very carefully at the experience in Scandinavian countries, other parts of Europe, the United States, as well as here in the United Kingdom. Our approach is very much one that is similar to Northern Ireland and to Scotland. And of course, if there's any new evidence, or the advice to me is that we can get children back into school more quickly for more face-to-face learning, believe me, I will grab that opportunity. But we'll continue to look at that and to ensure that we get children back as swiftly as we possibly can, because despite the efforts that everybody's making with regards to distance learning, there's no substitute, I know, for children being in school and face-to-face learning. So if I'm given the clearance to get more children back more quickly, I think the reason why we're having to be especially cautious, and I think it's important to recognise this, is the presence of the new variants. I think if we had been dealing with the original variant of COVID, we'd be in a very different position. But we know that the new variant of COVID is much more transmittable, and so we have to take that into consideration. And we have to take into consideration the advice that will have come from SAGE and SPI-M. It sounds very sinister, doesn't it, the SPI-M committee? But the SPI-M committee that provides advice on a UK-wide level that say if we get all children back in a big bang, in one go, that could lead to a significant jump in the R number. And if we know, and we know from the experience that we had last term, and especially in December, if community levels of transmission get out of control again, that has a devastating impact on our ability to keep schools operating. So they say that a big bang approach really risks jumping R above 1 again, and we've worked really hard to get it down, and we need to keep it down, and that's why our approach here is the one that we're taking in Wales. And I'm not aware of any country anywhere in the world that has had such a long period of lockdown, such a huge peak in cases, which we're tragically having to recover from, how they've opened up their schools in a single go. So we're following the science, and please, you know, the science is available for you to have a look at and take a look at for yourselves. But we're constantly checking and seeking new advice, new modelling, new data, and we will move as fast as we think that it is safe to do so. Moving to Jessica. Jessica asks, why have teachers not been prioritised for vaccines, and why are we sending younger children back first? Well, Jessica, the Welsh Government, indeed, as the other governments in the UK do, we're following the advice on vaccinations that was given to us by the JCVI. That committee is independent of politics and politicians, made up of experts who give advice on how any vaccination programme, immunisation programme should run in our country. And they have identified those groups who are most likely to suffer severe harm or death as a result of contracting COVID-19. So it's very much a risk-based approach, and those groups are outlined in sections of 1 to 9. Thanks to the tremendous efforts here in Wales, we are making fantastic progress moving our way through those groups, and we are confident that we'll be able to get through groups 1 to 9, offering a vaccine to everybody who in those groups who want to take up the opportunity. And I would urge you to take up that opportunity when it is your turn. We'll be able to get through those groups now by April, and then we will await further advice from the JCVI on which groups of individuals should be vaccinated next. I understand that that advice is imminent, because of course we're getting to the stage where we're going to have completed the first 1 to 9. I think it's important to recognise how anxious teachers, teaching assistants, those involved in, getting our children to school, those working in cleaning and cooking positions, all the people that are working in our schools. I understand how anxious that they are, but if you're most at risk because of your age or an underlying health condition, then you'll be picked up in those initial 9 groups. And in the hope of offering you some reassurance, studies show that teachers and those working with children in our schools are fortunately no more likely to die as a result of COVID than the general public. Indeed, other studies have shown that they are no more likely to be hospitalised as a result of contracting COVID than the general population. And a recent study in Scotland showed that they were no more likely to test positive. The best way we can keep our schools working is to make sure we keep community transmission levels low. That's where the real risk is, and that's why we're taking this cautious approach to returning children. And why the youngest children? Well, we know that the youngest children are the least likely to contract COVID, and thankfully the only silver lining, and it's a very thin one, I know, but we can be thankful that we know that COVID, fortunately, is a relatively mild disease or a very mild disease in children, but we know our youngest children are least likely to contract COVID and therefore are least likely to pass it on. So this is the lowest risk group of children in terms of transmission of the disease. And we also know that for our youngest children, the distance learning, which has been a challenge for everybody, and I don't want to diminish that challenge, but it has been particularly hard to deliver the foundation phase through distance learning, despite the best efforts of teachers. So that's why it's that cohort of children that have been prioritised first. And as I said, you'll see the same prioritisation in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And I am delighted that they have been beginning to go back this week. And just to talk to those children this morning, they were really, really pleased to be back, seeing their friends, seeing their teachers, and back learning and playing together. Michelle asks, my daughter is in year 12 and I'm wondering how she can possibly sit A-levels next year, having no experience of sitting exams. She did not do GCSEs, nor will she do her AS levels. She's applying for university, so for a student with no experience of having the pressure of sitting all or nothing exams, there's so much resting on the results. Well, first of all, Michelle, the best of luck to your daughter, and I find myself in exactly the same position. I too have a daughter sitting, who's in year 12, and the last formal exams that she will have sat were back in year 10, and it's only natural that you and she are anxious about the prospect of exams. I do hope that we will be in a public health situation that exams will go ahead next year, but please be assured that we will be working with schools, recognising the challenges that your daughter and others in her position will face, to ensure that they are prepared as well as they can be to get ready for those exams. So there will be extra support put in place, because we recognise that it will be a specific challenge for those children that have not sat their year 11 exams or not sat their AS level exams. And schools and colleges are aware of those issues, and we will be looking to support children, and I'm sure it's something that our regulator and our exam board will be considering as we move forward. But best of luck to her in her applications to university. Let's have a look. Alison says, do you think people should go back a year to catch up? Well, Alison, there may be some cases that perhaps, that is in the best interests of the child. But I think it's important to remember that all children have had their education interrupted, but they have continued to learn and experience things even whilst they've been out of face-to-face learning. What's really important is that we put together a package to support those children to re-engage in their learning and to continue to get back on track and to make progress. I think it's absolutely, of course, tempting to think about pouring extra pressure and extra lessons and extra content on children, but I'm always reminded by a quote which is attributed to Yeats, that education isn't about filling a bucket, it's about lighting a fire. And that takes us back to the point that was raised at the very beginning about addressing well-being. We really need to recognise the challenging situation that children have faced, and then we need to re-engage them in their learning and then support them to make the progress that they need to make. Recognising that all children's lessons and learning has been interrupted, there will be particular challenges for different parts of the cohort. We know that this has been a particularly difficult time for children with additional learning needs. We know that this has been a particularly difficult time for those families where it's been really difficult to engage in distance learning. We know it's been a particularly difficult time for those parents whose children are in Welsh medium education, but they don't speak Welsh at home. So there will be a need to make sure that there's specific support for different cohorts of children. And then for individual children, we know that there will be some children that will really need that extra individual help. Now, we've already employed an additional 1,000 members of staff in this academic year, and I will be announcing very shortly a longer-term strategy for the medium and longer term of how we can support children's education going forward. But being confident, you know, that our teachers know what needs to be done to move children forward in their learning, and we need to make sure that they're given the resources and the ability to do just that. Let me also then have a look at Katie. I think, yeah, Katie. There's a lot of speculation that the summer holidays would be cut and also longer school days. Is there any truth in this? Katie, there's long been a debate actually in education about whether we organise our academic year in a way that is best for children and best for learning. We do know that that 6-week summer holiday period can be really, really challenging, and many professionals will tell you and talk to you about how those first weeks in an autumn term in a normal year is about reacquainting children with school and catching up and getting them back to where they were when they left the school at the beginning of the summer holidays. So this is not a new phenomena, nor is it a new debate. So I think we need to have a debate about whether we organise our academic year in the most optimum fashion. But I think it's also important to recognise that children and families and those that work with them will need to have a break this summer. So that's really important as well. And if we were to shorten the summer holidays in any way at all, we would want to make sure that that time was reorganised later in the year. And again, I know that we're feeling much more hopeful that the vaccination is coming forward and giving us real hope, but you know, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that our scientists are a bit worried about what COVID might do in the autumn and the winter. So I think there is a debate to be had about whether we have a slightly shorter summer holiday and then add those weeks on maybe to the Christmas holidays when we think maybe we could find ourselves, you know, in a bit of a challenging situation again. In terms of the summer though, what I am pleased to say is that every summer we run a very successful food and fun programme in many of our communities where our junior children are able to go in and participate in lots of activities. We're doubling the amount of investment in that programme this summer. So many more children will be able to avail themselves of the opportunity, I hope, to engage in food and fun. There's lots of sporting activities, art activities, science, cooking, a really good time as well, and that's something that we'll be expanding to more children. As for extra hours, again, I think we have to be mindful of not overloading children and getting them back and then overwhelming them with extra lessons. So we've got to work thinking about what is best for children, yes, in the short term, but also making sure it's sustainable for them and having a longer term plan, not just for this academic year, but also for further academic years. Let's have a look at the next. Who else have we got here? Jane. Jane says, some staff are in school but have no access to lateral flow tests. That's not what they expected. Well, Jane, I'm sorry to hear that. A lot of tests have already been delivered and all schools will have those tests by the end of the week. Indeed, the school I was in this morning, it was great to hear that those tests had been delivered, and in fact the staff this morning had been administering those tests. So we'll be expecting any outstanding test deliveries to be completed before the end of this week. So I hope that they will be with you very, very shortly. Okay, let's have a look what else is coming in. Ashley, can Kirsty Williams please explain why the government is reviewing to open non-essential shops and hairdressers before all children are back in education? Well, Ashley, I know that people are joining all the time, and this kind of relates back to a question that we had earlier, but I think it's really important that we talk through the process about the decisions that we're making. The science tells us that we need to introduce children back into school gradually in tranches, and then to pause and to ensure that that reopening doesn't negatively impact on the public health scenario that we're facing in. And we're doing that as quickly as the scientists advise us to do, and that's in 3-week periods. So that first tranche of students, our foundation phase, going back from this week, and that will happen for 3 weeks. And we are confident if all the figures go in the right way, then we can, on the 15th of March, then move to having more children back for face-to-face learning. But as I said earlier, frustratingly, Easter is really, really, really early this year. And then we bump up against the Easter holidays before we've had a chance to review the impact of the second group of children going back on the public health situation. Believe me, the priority for the Welsh Government is to use any headroom that we have got to unlock restrictions on education first. But because potentially we are running into a period where children are out of school because of the recess, Government is also looking at whether there are other things that do not present a massive risk to our spiking again and cases getting out of control again, to see whether there are other things in a slowly and a considered way that could be unlocked. And the First Minister will be making an announcement on that basis at the next review. But education remains the government's, and has always been the government's priority. That's why we've got children back in school this week, and we haven't been able to unlock any other further measures. And as I said, we're constantly reviewing the advice and the guidance that is coming. We're learning all of the time, and if the advice is that we can move more quickly, that we don't have to wait for these 3-week periods, and there are opportunities to get children back more quickly this side of the Easter holidays, then believe me, then I will grab that opportunity, because just like you, I want children back in their schools, in their classrooms with their teachers as quickly as we are able to do so. Let's have a look at what is coming in. Okay, we've had a question here from Rebecca about masks and the delivery of masks. Well, Rebecca, I'm sorry to hear that masks haven't been delivered. We're the only government in the United Kingdom that has paid for schools to be supplied with their face coverings for both pupils and staff. But it is for each local authority to ensure that those supplies have got to you. We've given them the money, and they do the job of buying those supplies and then distributing them. So I would urge you to get in touch with your local education authority to understand when those face coverings will be with you. And I hope, but if you wanted to confidentially drop me a line about which one, then obviously we can pursue that for you. Okie dokes. Well, there are lots of people I can see asking about universities, and understandably we spend a lot of time talking about schools, but obviously we're managing this process for FE colleges and as well. Delighted that we were able to get more of our FE students back this week, especially those students that are taking qualifications that require them to do a practical element to demonstrate those skills. And again, On the 15th of March, we're hoping not only will we get some more of our children back to face-to-face learning in schools, that's also the same for FE colleges. If your child is studying equivalent qualifications in a sixth form college or your local FE college. With regards to universities, again, we're working very closely with the university sector to manage that return back cautiously and carefully, prioritising students who have practical elements of their courses, which make it absolutely, really difficult to be able to do for home. So whether that be our medics, for instance, or our nursing students. We are seeing some more students back in university this week. Again, asking universities to prioritise those that need access to the facilities that they can only find on their campuses. And we are working with other governments to understand, how we can extend that process on. But again, we're doing it carefully and cautiously, mindful of the science, and prioritising those students that really need to be on campus to be able to complete their studies. Clearly, there's a lot of cross-border flow. So we've got lots of Welsh domicile students who study in England, lots of English domicile students who study at Welsh universities, who are working very closely with the Westminster government on arrangements for testing and travel, and to make sure we're working collaboratively across the country, because we recognise that students potentially are travelling across borders, and hoping to make an announcement very shortly on enhanced testing that will allow more students back onto campus as quickly as we possibly can. Just to remind you that if you are a parent of a university student and you're worried about financial difficulties that your son or daughter may be experiencing, we have invested some £40 million in Welsh universities. First of all, some of that to support mental health services, to ensure that students have access to mental health support, but the vast majority of that money has gone into hardship funds. So if your son or daughter is having some difficulties financially, worried about finance, then they should approach their university for support and to ensure that that £40 million that the Welsh Government has invested gets out into students to support them, recognising that many of them have got extra expenditure or have not been able to get those part-time jobs that help sustain them through study. So that's any student that is studying at a Welsh university. If you're a parent of a child who is studying in other parts of the United Kingdom, then separate arrangements are made available, and they should approach their university to understand what levels of support that may have been made available in England, Scotland or Northern Ireland. Well, can I just thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to send your questions in this evening. We will continue to provide updates on latest announcements, decisions and policies on the Welsh Government media channels, as well as on the Welsh Government education channels. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, and good night.